Imagine waking up not as yourself, but as one of the most feared and celebrated figures in Viking lore, Ragnar Lothbrok. To understand what that life would feel like, we need to step inside a world where myth and history blur, and where survival depends on both cunning and steel. Ragnar's story begins in fragments. Historians still debate if he was one man, or a patchwork of many Viking leaders whose deeds were stitched together in saga and song. But let us walk as if he were real. Born into a world of cold winds and endless seas, you would grow up knowing that every day was a struggle, for food, for safety, and for reputation. To be Ragnar meant to rise above the ordinary, to chase honor so fiercely that your name outlived you. Life as Ragnar was not the life of a king in a palace. You were first a farmer, watching the soil struggle against the harsh northern climate. Yet your mind, like many Vikings, was restless. The sea called, and with it came opportunity. To be Ragnar was to look at the horizon and imagine wealth, adventure, and a story worth telling around the fire. The Viking way of life was demanding. Training with weapons began young, because raiding was not simply about plunder, but about identity. Vikings lived for reputation, for the honor their deeds could bring. If you were Ragnar, you would row a longship across icy waters, listening to the steady beat of oars and the creak of timber. You would stand with your warriors, driven not only by hunger for silver, but by a belief that your actions echoed into eternity. And yet, Ragnar's life was not only war. The sagas place him at the heart of a powerful family. His first wife, the shield maiden Lagertha, represented the Viking spirit of strength and independence. His later wife, Aslog, tied his destiny to prophecy and legend. His sons, Jon Ironside, Ivar the Boneless, Sigurd Snake, the Eye of Hvitserk, became as famous as their father, carrying the torch of his name across Europe. To be Ragnar was also to be a father, raising heirs who would carve their own marks into history. But where history ends, legend begins. The stories say Ragnar wore trousers made of animal skins, hardened with tar, earning him the name Lothbrok, or Hairy Breeches. They tell of dragons slain, of gods watching from above, of deeds so extraordinary that they slipped into myth. Whether these stories were true matters less than the fact that people believed them. To live as Ragnar was to exist in that fragile space between reality and legend. Ragnar's end is perhaps the most haunting part of his story. Captured by King Dulla of Northumbria, he was thrown into a pit of snakes, a death both brutal and symbolic. As the serpents coiled around him, the sagas say Ragnar sang of his life, proclaiming that his sons would avenge him. And indeed they did, launching the great heathen army, a force that shook the kingdoms of England to their core. Even in death, Ragnar's name stirred men to action. So what was it like to be Ragnar Lothbrok? It was to live in a world of constant struggle, where every act built your reputation. It was to straddle the line between farmer and raider, husband and warrior, mortal man and immortal legend. To be Ragnar was to embody the Viking ideal that life is short, but glory, if earned, might last forever. Part 1, Origins and Early Life. Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back into the dimly lit corridors of royal history. So, before we begin, I invite you to dim the lights, adjust your blanket, and let the day quietly dissolve. This isn't a tale of fast-paced battles or thrilling escapes. It's a story of fragile bloodlines, petty rivalries, and the strange ways monarchies tried, and usually failed, to keep their families afloat. So, if your eyes are already feeling heavy, good. That's the correct mood for tonight's wandering. We'll be floating through the origins and early lives of some of Europe's most curiously unfortunate royals. Those born into palaces but destined to discover that silk curtains do not protect against poor genetics, questionable parenting, or the crushing boredom of being technically important but personally miserable. Let's begin where so many sad royal stories begin, with the Habsburgs. Of course, it had to be them. If history is a long play filled with eccentric characters, the Habsburgs are the troupe that wandered on stage in costumes several sizes too small, insisted on only marrying each other, and then looked genuinely surprised when the results were not flattering. The Habsburg family had humble beginnings, which is easy to forget when you think of their later reputation as the dynasty that dominated half of Europe. Originally, they were Swiss counts, lingering in their castle near the Aire River. Not exactly the kind of origin story that screams global superpower. But the Habsburgs were persistent. They had the uncanny knack of arranging marriages that brought in more land than an entire campaign of warfare could. The motto of their dynasty became, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry," which is a charming way of saying, we will conquer through awkward family dinners and uncomfortable wedding nights. And, in fairness, it worked. At least politically. Genetically, not so much. But before we get into the jawlanes, yes, we'll get there. Let's take a gentle stroll into the early lives of a few Habsburg children. Because to be born into this family was, in many ways, to be born into an experiment in how much a bloodline can fold back on itself before collapsing. Take Charles Sever of Spain. who has the dubious honor of being known to history as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. The nickname suggests mystery, sorcery, maybe a sinister enchantment. In reality, it was just the polite 17th century way of saying, this poor man looks like a genealogical diagram that got caught in a blender. Charles was born in 1661, the son of Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria. And yes, you heard that correctly, Austria, as in, she was his niece. His mother was both his queen and his father's niece. Because of course she was. The family tree had stopped branching out a long time ago, and was now just folding politely back on itself like a fan. Now, childhood in a Spanish royal court should have been splendid. Gold-plated cradles, silken swaddling clothes, servants rushing to anticipate every sneeze. And Charles had all of that. But he also had, unfortunately, the full weight of Habsburg genetics pressing down on him. His jaw was so large and protruding it made eating and speaking difficult. He was small, sickly, and constantly unwell. Walking was a challenge. Reading was out of the question. His early life was not one of joyful princely frolics, but of doctors muttering nervously and courtiers pretending everything was perfectly fine. They didn't exactly help him. Out of fear of worsening his fragile health, Charles was kept away from education, exercise, and pretty much anything resembling normal development. His mother, who was also his aunt, again, because of course she was, decided that keeping him sheltered was the safest option. So while other children were learning to ride horses or swing wooden swords, Charles was confined to rooms where the only adventure was watching candles burn. Still, he was the king, or at least he was supposed to be. His childhood was essentially a waiting game where the courtiers hoped he would survive long enough to reach adulthood. He did, technically. But we'll come back to him in more detail later. For now, let's drift sideways to see how other royal children fared. Spoiler, not much better. Across Europe, in France, things were both grander and equally dysfunctional. The French court loved ceremony. Everything had to be draped in gold, perfumed, and presented with a flourish. But behind all that glitter were children who lived under a crushing system of etiquette that made normal family life impossible. Take Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King. He would later bathe vassals in light and opulence. But as a child, his existence was strangely precarious. He was born in 1638 after 23 years of his parents trying, unsuccessfully, to have a child. So when Louis finally appeared, everyone treated him as a miracle, which is never a healthy way to grow up. He was smothered in attention, given endless praise, and raised to believe he was not just important, but practically divine. His wet nurses treated him as if holding him improperly might cause the sun itself to fall out of the sky. And naturally, this created a child who was alternately lonely, anxious, and spoiled beyond recognition. He had toys, he had servants, but he didn't have much in the way of genuine companionship, because who can play tag with someone you've been told is literally God's gift to France? Meanwhile, over in England, royal childhoods were often more about survival than luxury. The Tudors, for instance, were not known for their gentle parenting. Henry Vere is often remembered for his 6 unfortunate wives, but his own childhood deserves a glance. Born in 1491, Henry wasn't actually expected to become king. That role belonged to his older brother Arthur. Yes, Arthur, the boy whose name sounded like he should be leading knights at a round table, rather than coughing in a cold, damp castle. But Arthur did just that, cough himself into an early grave at 15. And suddenly Henry, the second son, was thrust into the role. As a boy, Henry was athletic, charming, and startlingly clever. He could ride, hunt, debate, sing, and play instruments. His early life looked promising. But lurking in the background was his father, Henry Vue, who was paranoid to the point of obsession. The elder Henry hoarded money, distrusted everyone, and saw threats in every shadow. So while young Henry was being groomed as the spare, he was also growing up in an environment where fear and suspicion hovered constantly. It's no wonder he grew into an adult who loved control, dominance, and surrounding himself with people who could flatter him endlessly. After all, if your earliest memories involve watching your father glare at courtiers, as though they were plotting his murder during breakfast, you don't exactly grow up balanced. But let's drift gently back to the Habsburgs, because no royal childhood story is complete without revisiting them. Their origins and early lives are almost a masterclass in how not to raise children. One striking case is Joanne of Castile, better known to history as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad, born in 1479. Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the very monarchs who financed Columbus's voyage. So, yes, she grew up in a house where big decisions were made over dinner. But childhood in that court was far from idyllic. Joanna was highly intelligent, fluent in multiple languages, and deeply religious. But she was also sensitive, anxious, and prone to depression. Traits that, in any other family, might have been managed with patience and care. In hers, they were dismissed or, worse, exploited. Her parents used her marriage as a political chess move, sending her off to the Habsburg Netherlands to wed Philip the Handsome. Philip, by the way, was called the Handsome, mostly because he had a nice haircut and, compared to his relatives, vaguely symmetrical features. Joanna adored him. Unfortunately, Philip adored almost everyone else. He was unfaithful, manipulative, and dismissive of her emotions, which only deepened Joanna's fragile state. Her early married life was filled with jealousy, paranoia, and heartbreak. She became so fixated on Philip that when he died suddenly at 28, she refused to let his body be buried, dragging his coffin with her on travels across Castile. Courtiers whispered she had gone mad. Historians debate whether she truly suffered from severe mental illness or whether the label, mad, was simply a convenient excuse for men around her to seize power. Either way, Joanna spent most of her adult life locked away, first by her father, then by her son. A sad fate for someone who, as a child, had shown so much promise. And so, from Charles Si's sickly beginnings to Louis XIV's over, glorified nursery, from Henry V's shift from spare to hair to Joanna's descent into tragedy, we see a theme repeating itself. Royal origins were often gilded, but they were rarely golden. Children born into palaces found their earliest years weighed down with expectations, family politics, and the occasional unfortunate cousin marriage. As we move along, we'll notice how these early lives set the stage for the royal disasters that followed. Because if childhood is destiny, then in these courts, destiny usually involved questionable decisions, strange habits, and dynastic melodrama that could rival any modern soap opera. But that, of course, is a gentle drift for another part of our story. Part 2, The Viking Way of Life. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've settled a little deeper into your blanket since part 1, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight we're moving gently into another corner of the past, one that smells faintly of smoke, seawater, and badly preserved fish. We're drifting into the Viking way of life. Now, when most people hear Viking, they picture horned helmets, which they never wore, or towering warriors storming monasteries. That did happen, occasionally. But everyday Viking life was far less cinematic, and naturally far less glamorous. Being a Viking wasn't all raids and treasures. It was mud, chores, bad weather, and an impressive ability to pretend salted herring counted as dinner. Still, the Viking world has a kind of quiet rhythm to it. If you strip away the sagas and the axe, waving, you find a people who lived by the sea, worked the land, and passed long winters complaining about both. Let's start with the basics. Most Vikings were not warriors at all. They were farmers. Imagine endless fields of barley, oats, and rye, stretching beneath a grey sky that looked like it had been washed one too many times. They kept cows, sheep, and pigs, though the animals weren't treated with any particular tenderness. Livestock was useful, not beloved. You didn't name your cow Bessie. You named it Future Stew. A typical Viking household was built around the longhouse. Picture a wooden structure, narrow and elongated, with a roof sloping down low like it was perpetually tired. Inside, it was smoky and dim. The fire pit sat in the center, because heating was more important than visibility. Beds were tucked against the walls, stuffed with straw, and if you were very lucky, perhaps a bit of animal skin to soften things up. Privacy didn't exist. Your entire family, plus the occasional servant or thrall, slept within snoring distance. If someone kicked in their sleep, it was everyone's problem. The day began early. Chores were not optional. You fed the animals, mended tools, churned butter, or prepared meals that could charitably be described as nourishing, rather than delicious. Bread was coarse and heavy enough to qualify as a weapon. Fish was constant. Meat was rare enough to be exciting. And vegetables, when they appeared, were boiled into something so bland that even the turnips felt embarrassed. But while life was hard, Vikings had a certain balance to their daily rhythm. Men and women both worked. Viking women, unlike their medieval counterparts in much of Europe, had remarkable legal rights. They could inherit property, request divorces, and manage farms when their husbands went off on raids, or more often, fishing trips that somehow got rebranded as expeditions. If a woman was unhappy in her marriage, she could simply pack up her dory and leave, which is honestly a level of practicality that would have saved centuries of European queens a lot of grief. Children began working young. They weren't exactly enrolled in a Viking Montessori program. By the age of 7 or so, boys were helping in the fields and learning to handle weapons, while girls were spinning wool, preparing food, and tending to animals. Childhood was short. Play existed, yes. There were games with carved wooden toys, and board games like Nefertoffel, a kind of Viking chess where the king is always in danger. Which, to be fair, is a fairly accurate summary of Viking rulership in general. But beyond farming and chores, the Vikings were of course seafarers. Their longships are legendary. Slender, fast, with shallow drafts that allowed them to slip up rivers as easily as they crossed seas. To step into one was to step into the beating heart of Viking culture. It meant adventure, danger, and a great deal of rowing. Because for all the heroic poetry, most of the time, being on a longship meant sore arms and a back that would haunt you for days. And yet, Those ships opened the world. To be a Viking was to live in a small wooden house in a cold northern land, and also to know that beyond the horizon lay places as strange as Constantinople, as rich as Paris, and as ill prepared for your arrival as Lindisfarne. The sea was a highway, and the longship was a ticket to everything beyond the farm. Religion, too, shaped daily life. The Norse gods were not distant figures. They were woven into everything. Odin the one-eyed wanderer, Thor the thunderer, Freyja with her cats, Loki the trickster always ruining family gatherings. Sacrifices were made, festivals were held, and the gods were invoked for protection, for crops, for success in raids. It wasn't so much belief as an atmosphere. Life was precarious, and so you leaned on the gods like you leaned on a sturdy walking stick. Now, despite the warrior stereotype, Vikings didn't spend every moment sharpening axes. Raiding season, if you will, was in summer, when the seas were navigable. The rest of the year was spent very much like any other farmer in Europe, tilling soil, storing food, repairing what had broken, and wondering if your roof would survive another winter storm. The difference was that when summer came, instead of simply visiting the next village's market, some Vikings thought it would be more fun to cross the sea and ransack a monastery. Because why settle for turnips when you could have gold, manuscripts, and wine?
Still, it wasn't all looting. Vikings were traders too. Their world stretched far wider than raids alone. They carried furs, amber, and walrus ivory south, and returned with silver, silk, and spices. Archaeologists have found Arabic coins in Viking hordes, proof of connections stretching as far as Baghdad. So if you were a Viking child in Norway, you might grow up eating porridge every day. But you could also end up wearing beads that had traveled thousands of miles. And then there was reputation. In Viking society, honor was everything. To be called a coward was worse than death. Sagas tell us that a man's worth was not measured by how much land he owned, but by how loudly others would sing of him around the fire. Feuds erupted over insults as much as over resources. If someone wronged you, the expected response was swift and usually violent, which is probably why their poetry, while beautiful, often sounds like someone politely describing an axe murder. Speaking of poetry, the Vikings loved stories, long, winding sagas that blended history with myth. These weren't written down until centuries later, but they were recited, remembered, and passed on like treasures. If you were lucky enough to hear one, it probably lasted hours, filled with tales of gods meddling, heroes falling, and ancestors doing things that made your family seem far more impressive than reality allowed, which, of course, is the entire point of family stories. But daily life was not without its darker edges. Slavery was common. Thralls were captured during raids or born into servitude. They worked the hardest tasks, had no rights, and could be bought or sold. For all the modern admiration of Viking independence and resilience, it's important to remember that their society was built on hierarchy, with thralls firmly at the bottom. As for health, let's just say that Viking medicine was equal parts practical and unfortunate. Herbal remedies were common, but so were charms and rituals. If you had a toothache, someone might prescribe chewing a piece of wood carved with runes. Effective. Not really. Entertaining, perhaps. Lifespans weren't long. Living into your 40s was respectable. Reaching 50 was almost impressive, and while sagas make warriors sound invincible, one unlucky fall on the ice could end a life just as quickly as battle. Winter was the hardest. Long nights, scarce food, endless cold. This was when feasting mattered most. Not because there was much food to feast on, but because gathering together, telling stories and drinking mead helped people forget, at least briefly, that outside the longhouse the world was frozen solid, and so to be a Viking was not to live a constant adventure. It was to wake up to chores, endure weather, pray for decent harvests, and occasionally step into a longship to see what the horizon had to offer. It was a life both ordinary and extraordinary, mundane in its rhythms, and yet somehow expansive enough to carry Scandinavian farmers across oceans. Of course, the sagas emphasized the extraordinary. Nobody was going to write a poem about Bjorn repairing a fence. They were going to write about Bjorn battling sea monsters, or Bjorn discovering Iceland, or Bjorn stabbing someone who looked at him funny in a mead hall. But underneath the sagas, you still find the steady heartbeat of daily life fires burning in smoky halls, women managing households, children learning too fast, and men rowing endlessly, dreaming of fame. And perhaps that's the true Viking way of life, a blend of hardship, ambition, and storytelling. Ordinary people living ordinary days, wrapped in legends that made them seem larger than life, which in the end is exactly why their memory still lingers half history, half myth, and entirely human. Let's drift from their farms and longships now, and wander quietly toward another royal figure whose life, while wrapped in grandeur, carried the same fragile humanity beneath it. Part 3. Ragnar as a warrior and raider. Hey everyone. By now, you've probably settled deeper under your blanket. Maybe the room is quiet, maybe there's a faint hum of night traffic or the ticking of a clock. Wherever you are, let's drift back again, this time to the sea. Because tonight, Ragnar stops being just another farmer with too many chores and starts being, well, slightly more violent. The image of Ragnar Lothbrok as a warrior is half history, half bedtime story told by Vikings who enjoyed exaggeration as much as ale. He's remembered as one of the great raiders, the man who brought terror to the shores of England and France. But if we peel back the layers, we find a man, or perhaps several men stitched together, who follow the natural Viking rhythm. Farm in spring, raid in summer, repair your roof in autumn, and then complain about the weather until the cycle began again. So, what did it mean to be Ragnar the warrior? First, it meant rowing, hours of rowing. The sagas skip this part, of course. Nobody wanted to hear about oarsmen with sore hands and blistered backs. But every raid began with men stuffed into longships, shoulder to shoulder, moving rhythmically through the waves. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. It was, in fact, a little boring. But boring details rarely make it into sagas, so instead we get tales of Ragnar leaping ashore with an axe in each hand, conveniently skipping over the fact that he probably smelled like herring and hadn't bathed in weeks. His first great raid, according to legend, was on the British Isles. The monasteries along the coast were easy pickings. They were filled with treasures, chalices, manuscripts, gold crosses, and defended by a handful of bewildered monks whose combat experience peaked at swinging incense burners. To Ragnar and his men, this was less battle and more awkward burglary. But of course, the sagas made it sound grand, with poetic descriptions of blood and fire, when in reality, it was probably over in minutes, and followed by someone tripping over a sheep. Ragnar's fame grew not only from raiding, but from how he styled himself. He supposedly wore trousers of animal skin, hardened with pitch, which earned him the nickname Lothbrok, or shaggy breeches. One wonders how intimidating this truly looked, perhaps terrifying, perhaps closer to an unfortunate experiment in Viking fashion. Either way, it stuck, and suddenly he was not just Ragnar, farmer turned warrior, but Ragnar Lothbrok, the man with memorable pants. But raiding was never just about plunder. It was about reputation. To be Ragnar was to seek honor, to carve a name that others would whisper around firelight. Every raid was both practical and performative. Yes, the silver helped. Yes, the cows, the grain, and the occasional barrel of wine were welcome. But what mattered most was that others knew you had taken them. The story was as valuable as the loot. So Ragnar pressed further, to Francia, the land we now think of as France. The Frankish kings were wealthy, their towns prosperous, their churches glittering with treasures. And also, they were hilariously unprepared for men in longships appearing out of nowhere. Rivers that seemed peaceful suddenly carried warriors upstream, and before anyone could react, villages were in flames. One of Ragnar's most famous raids took place in 845, when he sailed up the Seine and threatened Paris itself. Imagine it, a city bustling with life, merchants in markets, children chasing each other through winding streets, and suddenly a fleet of dragon, proud ships on the horizon. Panic, screaming, and Ragnar, with his breeches, striding onto the scene. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, yes, that was his actual nickname, though records suggest he wasn't entirely bald, faced a dilemma. His army was disorganized, his people terrified, and Ragnar was at the gates. So Charles did what many rulers in history have done when faced with Vikings. He paid them a massive sum of silver, equivalent to years of revenue, just to make them go away, which naturally worked for a while. But it also set a precedent. Pay Vikings once, and they'll return next season like very aggressive tourists. And Ragnar? He left Paris with silver, fame, and the knowledge that sometimes the easiest raid was the one you didn't have to fight for. The sagas say he laughed, of course. Vikings always laughed in sagas, because nothing says terrifying like giggling while holding an axe. But while Paris was a highlight, the raiding life was not endless glory. For every monastery dripping with gold, there were countless villages with nothing but salted fish and angry peasants wielding pitchforks. And for every successful raid, there were storms, shipwrecks, and hunger gnawing at the men in their longships. Being a raider was high, risk high, reward and occasionally high, disappointment. Still, Ragnar's legend grew. He was remembered not only for victories, but for his boldness. He didn't simply raid the edges. He pushed inland. He tested kings. He wanted more than plunder. He wanted his name etched into memory, and memory, after all, was the true Viking treasure. The sagas, however, cannot resist embellishment. They give us Ragnar slaying a dragon to win his first wife, Lagjotha, a detail which, unfortunately, is suspiciously absent from archaeological records. No dragon bones have been found in Denmark, though, to be fair, archaeologists do occasionally find sheep bones that look strange if you squint hard enough, so perhaps the legend began there. Still, the dragon story served its purpose. It made Ragnar larger than life. He wasn't just a man in breeches. He was a hero, a dragon's lair, a husband to a shield maiden, no less. Whether true or not, the story carried weight. And in a culture where stories mattered more than reality, that was enough. But let's pause for a moment. Because for all his fame as a warrior, Ragnar's life as a raider was probably not so different from that of other Vikings. What made him stand out was less the reality of his raids and more the persistence of his legend. Hundreds raided Paris. Dozens attacked England. Yet we remember Ragnar. Why? Because people kept telling his story. Because sagas need heroes, and Ragnar, with his breeches, his dragon, and his unlucky death, fit the role perfectly. And so, as a warrior, he was brave, yes. As a raider, he was successful, certainly. But as a figure of memory, he was unbeatable. His raids blurred into legend, his victories exaggerated, his defeats softened by poetic retellings. To be Ragnar, the warrior was not just to fight, but to become the character others needed. Of course, all warriors have their limits. Raiding cannot last forever, and Ragnar, despite the sagas painting him as almost immortal, would meet his end. But before we drift there, let's rest a little in the quieter reality of his raids. Imagine the longship again. The rhythmic creak of oars, the slap of waves against the hull, the salt air filling your lungs, and Ragnar, sitting with his men, not laughing this time, but staring at the horizon, knowing that beyond it lay both treasure and danger. That's the Viking way. And for Ragnar, it was the stage where he became more than just a farmer with unfortunate trousers. It was where he became the man whose name still drifts through the centuries. Half true, half legend, entirely unforgettable. Let's drift onward, then, from Ragnar the warrior to Ragnar the father, because as much as sagas love battles, they love dynasties even more, and Ragnar's children would become as famous, sometimes more infamous, than he ever was. And that, my friends, is where we leave Ragnar tonight. The farmer who became a raider, the raider who became a legend, and the legend who became a bedtime story for us more than 1,000 years later. If you're still awake, well done. If you drifted off somewhere between the shaggy trousers and the silver of Paris, that's even better. That was the point. So as we close the book on Ragnar Lothbrok for now, let the longships fade into the dark sea, let the oars quiet, and let the sagas become soft whispers in the back of your mind. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If you enjoyed wandering through this strange, sleepy piece of history, feel free to join again another evening. Until then, rest well, dream gently, and may your night be a little calmer than Ragnar's was. Good night.